by his drug-abusing father at the age of 2, Vince Miller grew up in a challenging and anxiety-producing environment. He endured the strain of his mother's 2 failed marriages, as well as her poor choices and drug use. Fortunately, during his formative teen years, his grandfather stepped up to mentor Vince, guiding him through a particularly difficult period. Though he resisted initially, Vince surrendered his life to Christ at the age of 20, and soon after, he was with his grandfather on his deathbed as cancer took his life. Vince committed to give back by mentoring men as his grandfather had mentored him. Vince's story demonstrates the importance of mentors to support others in overcoming the enormous hurdles that manhood, mentoring, fathering, and leadership present to a man who wants to live right. Vince's stories motivate, convict, sometimes even shock. He inspires men to lead, mentor, and disciple others. After serving in ministry organizations for 25 years, he founded Resolute, which is his current organization, a nonprofit focused on providing men with tools for discipleship and mentorship. Stick around after the show if you want to learn more from Vince. He has generously made his time available. He's just here to be with you guys. That's what any of us are here for. So without any further, please welcome Vince. Thank you.
Hey guys, nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. Yeah, see, there we go. Wake up. Thank you. I appreciate that so much, John. Just the introduction. I would like to meet each and every one of you guys if you have time afterward. I know you know my name. I'd love to get to know you as well. And so just to take some of the tension off the table, I actually grew up in San Francisco. Is that any better? So I grew up on the West Coast in a little town called Vallejo. It's Northeast Bay. Right across from the Golden Gate Bridge, grew up in the Oakland Hills there, and was raised by an atheist father who was such a starch atheist that we didn't actually use God's name as a curse word in the house. Think about that for a second. Think about that. My mom was an agnostic. She walked away from her faith. She grew up in a Christian home, but walked away from her faith, and she just couldn't make sense of it. She felt like damaged goods by the church. And so I was raised in an environment that was very anti-Christ. In fact, my mother and father tried to convince me every day of my life that God wasn't real for 2 reasons. 1, Christians are hypocrites, and nothing but broken people go to church. And I came to find out that they were right. Actually, Christians are hypocrites, and the church is full of broken people. But I came to discover through the relationship that I had with my grandfather that my faith wasn't based upon the church or other Christians. My faith was based on a man named Jesus Christ who died for me and did everything that he said he was going to do. And it took my grandfather years to unwind some of those things that were bound up in my mind, but he took time and invested in my life, and because of it, I'm standing here today sharing this message with you. It's pretty profound, but very, very simple. You know, I think that when people complicate things and try to convince us that Christianity isn't true, they use odd forms of logic sometimes, unfortunately. And it took my grandfather a lot of time and a lot of investment and simple conversations to unwind those things, but his investment in my life was actually worth the time. My grandfather was actually a simple guy. There was nothing special about him. He was an old Navy vet, retired, bald, big athletic-looking kind of dude, had a tattoo on his arm that said Walter Lee Baker, which was his name. He got after drinking too much one night, spelled correctly, by the way, and told me every day of his life, never get one of these. So you can attest to it, I don't have a tattoo named Walter Lee Baker on my arm right here. And I always listened to him about most things in life because he was always very challenging and simple ways to me. He did a number of things every day of his life because he was so disciplined. One of the things he did every day of his life was he golfed. So I grew up with a grandfather who golfed every day of his life, except for Thursdays, which was Women's Day. And he had all kinds of reasons for not golfing on Thursdays, I'll tell you. And he just invested in my life. I'll never forget the moment that he came over actually to my mom and dad's house. My mom divorced my dad when I was 2. Mom got remarried again, divorced again by the time I was about 12. At this point, my mom decided not to marry anymore because she could see it was having an effect on my life. And so she said, Vince, I'm not going to marry anymore. And instead, she thought it was a great idea just to have boyfriends in and out of the house. Which was a tragic mistake, by the way, because I was picking up all kinds of things from these people that were constantly in and out of my house. Until finally one day, when I was about 13, 14 years old, my grandfather came over and knocked on the door. Now, this is really unusual. You have to think about this. I had never seen a Christian person in our house ever in our entire life. And my grandfather comes over to the house, knocks on the door, and sits down and has a conversation with my mom. I'm so perplexed by it and so intrigued that I stood around the corner from the kitchen and I listened in to what my grandfather did. My grandfather asked for permission to spend time with me. Now, this was hyper unusual because my mom was very protective about me spending time with Christian people. Because, see, I'd never spent time in the church or in a camp or prayed or seen a Christmas tree in anybody's house. Dead serious. Until finally my grandfather came over and said, please let me spend time with Vince. And she caved. It was very interesting. She just abdicated raising me. And so basically I moved out of my mother's house and into my grandfather's house. And I got to tell you, in my grandfather's house, everything was very, very different. There were Christmas trees. There were prayers at meals. There was respect and discipline. There were healthy meals every evening. It wasn't just Totino's pizza rolls and Swanson dinners. It was actually a protein and a vegetable and a starch that my grandmother cooked every evening around a table where 3 people sat and had a conversation about their day. Shocking, right? Started with a prayer and ended with, you may be excused, when everybody else is done. It was just remarkably different than where I had grown up. And my grandfather spent all this time just kind of pouring into me. He would pick me up from school, bring me home, and invest in my life at the age of 70, by the way, for a kid who was 15, 16, 17, 18. I mean, it was remarkable. And I got to tell you, he couldn't do some of the things that I could do, but I can tell you, he could play golf with me, and he could talk with me, and he taught me things about manhood, about life, about women, about future, about sin, about his mistakes, about conflict, about my dad, about my mom. And very, very slowly, he started to unwind these conversations about God. It wasn't right in my face, but he took opportunities to have very thoughtful discussions with me about life. One of the things my grandfather taught me how to do was he taught me how to drive. Actually taught me how to drive on this pickup truck right here. This exact pickup truck, by the way. This is a 1959 Chevy Apache step-side pickup truck. My grandfather bought this on the showroom floor in 1958. Drove it his whole life daily to one place, the golf course. That was it. You'd get into this and people would stare at him for years. It was pristine. It used to be a Chevy tan color when he originally bought it. I know there's a few car guys in this room. I see you with your shirts on. And then in the 70s, he had it restored, and he had it painted gold metal flake, because that was cool in the 70s for some reason. And then when I turned 15, he had it restored to this condition right here. I'll never forget it. It was a big talk of the town, because everybody knew who my grandfather was. Bald guy in a red truck. You know who that guy is. But I'll never forget going into the body shop to watch the guys work on it. And they were just kind of standing around looking at this thing as it's pulled off the chassis. They've got the entire body all stripped down, and they can't find one ding in this truck. Not one ounce of Bondo on this truck. And they're just perplexed by it. And it was a classic when I was 15. Now, grandfather had it restored to this condition. We used to show it occasionally. But he made this proposition with me when I turned 15. He said this: if you can learn how to drive Liz, that was her name, Liz, the truck. If you can learn how to drive Liz, I will give her to you when you turn 16. That's pretty cool, ain't it? I see you shaking your head. You wish you had a truck that cool when you were 16, right? But I remember getting in this truck after that moment that he made me this, what you want to call it. It's a proposition or a dare. or a challenge, but as soon as he told me that, I paid attention to everything that my grandfather did. Everything. From age 15 to 15 and a half until I got my pink slip, I studied him day and night. Anytime we got in that truck and went to the golf course, I watched everything he did, and he showed me around Liz. And I want you to know that there was nothing automatic about this truck right here. Not one feature on this truck is automatic. You know, big bus-like steering wheel, right? You had to use both arms on one side to get it to turn as the tires kind of glued themselves to the pavement in the California sun. I gotta tell you, there's nothing like that. My skinny little arms could hardly handle it. There's no power steering on this thing. 3-on-the-tree transmission, non-synchro, which meant you had to stop before you put it in a gear because it would just grind until it finally fell in, right? Had a starter on the floor. I had to actually get out of the seat to reach it because the seats didn't adjust and they didn't have seat belts, right? Wing windows, we call that an air conditioner, right? Crank windows, right? I remember about 5 years ago, I got one of my kids, my middle child, into a car with a crank window, and he looks over at it and he goes, "What in the living world is that, Dad?" I said, "Well, that is called a window crank." He says, "What do you use it for?" I said, "To roll down the window," right? And then he reaches over on it like this, and he starts cranking it down, and he looks at it. He looks back at me, and he says, "This is the stupidest thing I've ever seen. Why would anybody ever waste their time doing this?" Right? Well, my grandfather taught me how to do everything in this truck until I turned about 15 and a half. I went and got my pink slip on a different car, came home, asked, first question to my grandfather, "Can I take the truck out for a drive?" "Can I take it out for a drive?" He says, "Of course, let's go." So we hop out in the truck and get the thing started. We take off down the street. I get about 3 blocks away. I come to a stop on a hill. On a hill. Because in California, you're either going up or down or 90. That's it. And this truck don't go 90. So you're going up or down or 55, basically. And I came to the stop on this hill, and this woman pulled up right behind me. As close as she could possibly get. So close that my short little self can't even see her face. She's that close. And of course, I put to use everything that my grandfather has taught me to this point. Please know this is only the second time I pulled out of first gear in this truck, ever. So here I am in this moment. I got one foot down on the brake, another foot down on the clutch, right? Drop it into first gear, down toward me and down. Move my hand from the shifter to the steering wheel. Reach my left arm down on the emergency brake, pull up on it while holding in on the button, move my foot from the brake to the gas, and I start working the gas. Now, I don't know if you can see what I'm doing right now, but I'm using every available appendage in my body to function this truck in this moment, right? And I'm hoping, because I can look back in the mirror and see that this woman is pulled way too close to me, that I do not strike this woman behind me. So I start working the gas, and I start working the clutch. Now, what you need to know about the clutch on this truck is it's got this huge spring-loaded arm bearing itself into that transmission, right? That clutch is so hard to move. I mean, your legs would get shaky if you can't squat about 225, right? Because you got to be able to not only push it down and engage it, you've got to find where that spring is going to pop on that thing. And it's not smooth. It wasn't invented to be smooth. This was a farm truck. It was meant to be driven on a farm. It's a big piece of sheet metal. So I'm trying to find this place in the clutch, and my grandfather can see that I'm kind of nervous, and I'm working the gas a little bit too hard. And then my grandfather in the passenger seat looks over in the side view mirror and can see that there is a woman pulled way too close to me. He crosses his arms and then turns his bald head to me and says, "Son, you better not scratch my truck." Dead serious, that's what he said. And I was scared to death. Because I was scared to death, I started working the gas more. Because there's no way I'm going to hit that woman. This truck has never been dinged, ever, ever. So I just start working the gas, and I get it up to about 4,000 RPMs, about 5,000 RPMs, where it starts to ting a little bit. I'm about to let this clutch out, because I am not going to go backwards. It may hurt going forward, but I'm not going to go backward. And I got to tell you, my grandfather saw what I was about to do, and he said, "Stop, stop." So I stopped. He said, "Take your foot off the gas, rest the clutch for a second, put it into neutral." He says, "Let me tell you what I used to do when I was a kid." And so here I am, I'm sitting here in this moment pretty nervous, rested, waiting to get some sage old advice, and he says, let me tell you what I used to do when I was a kid. And I'm quickly putting together his age, he's about 70. I'm going, okay, so this is at least 50 years ago. What kind of car were you driving 50 years ago? And he says, here's what we used to do when we were in these situations when we were kids. We would just gently roll the car backward into the car behind us, rest the car on the bumper, and then take off. That was his advice. And I kind of looked at him a little bit bewildered. And then he looked back at me, and then he squinted his eyes and crossed his arms again and said, "But you better not scratch my truck." He was dead serious about it, too. And I went right back down to ignoring him. I got my foot on the gas, I got my foot on the clutch, I started to get going. This woman got impatient and just kind of rolled backwards, and as soon as she did, I took off around the corner and just kind of squeaked out of it, barely. But I felt like in that moment, guys, that I had conquered the world. It's hard to describe what that moment was like for me, that split second right there. But it was so interesting to sit next to another man that would challenge you, show you, develop you, sit by your side, have conversations through thick and thin, even the more difficult moments of your entire life, and right there just stay with you because he knew you were worth it. And the moment was worth it. Well, that was my grandfather. My grandfather was like that with everything in life. And he just understood how to, with simple skills and a little bit of time, draw me in and make an investment in me that would last an eternity. In fact, my grandfather taught me how to parallel park on this truck right here. Seriously, parallel park on that truck right there in San Francisco. Every Saturday morning for 3 hours. For 6 months, he made me get up on Saturday morning and go driving and parking with him in that truck. Isn't that crazy? It was the most unenjoyable activity of that 6 months ever. I hated it. It was horrible. Everybody else was out doing other things. I was learning to drive lifts right here, which you think would be great, but it took all the fun out of it completely, right? First for a couple of months in flat areas, the next couple of months on inclines, and the next couple of months on declines. And no joke, this is what we did on Saturdays. We would drive around the Bay Area, and my grandfather would say, "Park there, park there, park there, park there, park there." And you know what? I'll never forget what he did with me in those moments. Because my grandfather did die. He died of cancer a few years later. And my wife and children never met him. But I can tell you, they meet my grandfather all the time. Because anytime we go downtown Minneapolis or St. Paul or somewhere in the truck, my wife will look down at the street and say, "You can't get this truck into that spot right there." To which I reply, "Woman." I don't really say that, but woman, challenge accepted. And my wife will attest to over 23 years of marriage that she has never seen me not parallel park perfectly the very first time an inch from a curb in any vehicle. And you know what that is? That's master mentoring, is all it is. It's master mentoring. It's some man taking a little bit of his time and a little bit of his skill and investing it into another man's life that pays out dividends into the future. It's crazy. It's super simple. It's super simple. The funny thing is that my grandfather actually died when I was in my 20s, early 20s. I was off at college in Oklahoma where I went to college. Grandmother called me and said, "You need to come home, your grandfather's got cancer." Flew into San Francisco, went straight to the hospital, walked into a room where I didn't recognize my grandfather. It was the first time in my life I could hardly recognize him. All the hair was gone from his body. Skin was actually hanging on his bones because his muscles were so deteriorated. I sucked it into his head. He had his teeth out because he couldn't tolerate the pain of just even keeping his teeth in. And I walked into the room and I thought I was in the wrong room. But I looked there at a man who was dying because he had gotten cancer into his nervous system in his spine. And it was creating excruciating pain. But he sat up in his bed, which was very painful, and he smiled at me. And then in that moment, I recognized him. He sat up and he had a conversation with me for 1 hour. That was it, 1 hour. No one else was in the room. No one else came. My grandmother refused to sit there. So I was in this room with him. For an hour, he had a conversation with me about life, about future, about family, about girls, about his truck. For some reason, it was still his truck, but I was going to argue with him. And then we smiled, and then he laid down, and I watched him die for 5 hours. And it was excruciating. I don't know if you've ever seen somebody in that situation or that moment, but basically you're just waiting for them to die as they kind of take in this morphine drip to kind of ease the pain, and you're just watching life drift away between the gasp for air. It's like ambient noise in the room where you wonder, is it going to be this breath or that breath? And it just gets longer between the breaths until finally they take the last one. And I'll never forget those 5 hours, because those 5 hours were significant for me. Those 5 hours for me were the most thought-provoking, powerful moment of my entire life, where I had an out-loud conversation unashamedly with God in that moment. And I got to tell you, that conversation with God was so honest and so open and so real. I remember saying to God, for the rest of my life, I want to do for other men what my grandfather did for me, which was mentor me. I knew what I was called to do in that very moment at the age of 20. I knew it. I knew that my grandfather's investment was so valuable that I needed to repeat that over and over and over again for men across the world, which I have done to this point. Isn't that crazy? But then I asked God for one thing, and I asked him for this one thing. I said, but God, will you please replace my grandfather to me in my life with another man that will walk the journey with me? Now, I want you to hear that request guised in the fact that I had 1 dad, 2 dad that were failure, 3 dad finally found him, and now I was losing him. So this was deeply lonely for me, gentlemen. Mother abandoned me, father gone, dad, now I call him my spiritual father. I'm losing him. I just wanted someone to walk with me in life. That was it. And so immediately leaving his funeral, I started to pursue ministry, and have pursued it ever since. I'm doing things just like I'm doing with you here on this day, with groups throughout the world. In fact, I'll be at Camp Forest Springs this fall at Man Camp. I'd love to have you there. But I'm going to tell you, as often as I've gotten to do some of these things and follow the call that God has presented to me, I also sought a mentor. And for about 20 years, I sought men to mentor me. I would go right up to them and I'd say, hey, would you mentor me? I see something in you that I would love to have for my life. Would you show me the way? And I would invite these guys into this journey, and over 20 years, I asked over a couple of hundred men, and no one, not one, ever took me up on my offer. And I'm a pretty driven guy. I'm pretty forward. I'm pretty direct. And I would ask these guys. And over 20 years, I noticed this pattern and discovered I was always getting 2 answers, and only 2 answers. And I think God irritated me with these things. Here are the 2 answers I got. I don't know what to do, and I don't have time. You've heard those answers. You've sought mentorship in your life. You may be even given other people those excuses. And I gotta tell you, it used to bother me and it used to disturb me until I finally asked God, why am I only hearing these 2 excuses? And then I discovered why. I discovered why through the greatest issue of man. Turn back to him for a moment to the beginning of time. Here at the beginning of time, you see the greatest issue with men. And it's not what you think the issue is. It actually goes deeper than all other manifested issues and sins and problems in life. Because think about this for a second, if you are a believer sitting in this room. We believe that God created all things. All things. And then in the middle of God's creation, God dropped man, gender male. That's what he did. He created man to have dominion and authority and power over God's creation, as if God is mildly entertained by what his creation might do with everything he's just given him. And then God tells him one thing to do. Don't do this one thing. Don't eat of the tree in the middle of the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Just don't do that one thing. He doesn't give him 10 rules. Because maybe he knows he's slow. I don't know. He just gives him one and says, don't do this thing. And then God gives him this opportunity to define his creation. And he says, name things. So man starts grunting and making utterances that come out of his lungs and across his vocal cords, and he starts naming creation. Again, I think God is mildly entertained by this. I wonder what he's going to call that thing, or that thing, or that thing. But he gives man some freedom to do things within inside of some boundaries. And then God creates the most interesting thing that he ever creates. And it's not woman. It's desire in a man's heart. It's quite fascinating, actually, because God doesn't create woman for man right away. He waits. He waits until something brews inside of him. And every one of you have it. Call it passion, call it longing, call it desire, call it vision, call it mission. But God allows it to brew inside of you, every one of you. And it's unique to every one of you. But he's given it to you, desire. And then the right way to get those desires filled, to get them fulfilled, is to go to God and ask him to fulfill him. So what does God do? He provides out of man, he provides what is called woman, which literally means out of man, for relationship and community. And then crazy thing, Genesis 3 happens. 3 chapters into the Bible, everything falls apart. Everything's going great until Genesis 3. And then in Genesis 3, what you have is this, is you have woman in the middle of the garden, close to this tree that they're not supposed to eat from. She comes upon a talking serpent. I know it sounds ridiculous, right? It has always sounded ridiculous to me, but I've seen talking geckos on commercials, so I know that it probably can happen, right? So here she is having this conversation with this serpent. Probably not the first time that she's had this conversation. She's engaged with it, and while she's engaged in this conversation, man is over here watching this whole thing happen. And what's fascinating about it is man does nothing and says nothing. You will notice him not do one thing, and you will notice him not say one thing, which I find to be perplexing, because man has been given dominion, power, authority, one moral rule, the ability to define things, and in a moment of injustice does nothing and says nothing. Which I think is the root to all sin for all men and all time. You see, our greatest problem in this life are not the sins that we commit in this life and the guilt that you feel around it. The greatest sin in our life and our greatest failing is in the face of a moment where God has called us to lead, to do nothing and say nothing. Because I gotta tell you guys, you're gonna screw things up every once in a while. But I actually think God mildly smiles when we screw things up, because we just figured out another way how to not do something. And if you're an entrepreneur or a salesperson in this room, you understand that getting to a no or building a business requires a lot of no's, a lot of the time, and a lot of failure to get to something that works. But to sit in apathy and indifference and inaction, when God has called every one of you, to stand up and to speak up for the things that he has put on your heart and to do nothing, that is the greatest problem with man. And I believe that God has called me to challenge men like you to get all in, move off the bench and into the game of life by being apathetic no more. Be apathetic no longer in any place in your life. Because I guarantee right now here in this room, there are men that feel an apathetic voice toward doing something right at this moment. That you put something off, you've waited too long, you've chosen not to address something, even personal pain, and I believe that Satan is afraid of men who fight that apathetic impulse. And God is calling you to do it like right now. It's because of my grandfather's courage to step into that house on that day a long time ago when I was about 14 years old that it changed the trajectory of my life. He could have done nothing and said nothing, but he boldly walked into a place that he knew he would not be accepted for a faith that he had, that he knew that his daughter did not embrace, against a man, my biological father, who directly opposed every one of his beliefs. And yet he stepped into it and made a difference in my life forever. And I believe that God calls all men to do this as well. Fascinating moment earlier this year with my son, who is now 18. He's played soccer his whole life. He's going off to college to play soccer this next year at a college in Minnesota, at a college in Minnesota. And I got to tell you, he's excited about it. But this year, something really interesting happened where I had to teach my son how to fight that apathetic impulse. He comes into my house at the beginning of hockey season, and all of his friends are begging and pleading him to come play hockey. My son has never played a day of hockey in his life, ever. He's played pickup hockey on the pond in the backyard of our house, and some of his hockey friends have seen him play, but they begged him to come and try out for White Bear Lake High School varsity soccer. He comes to me on the Friday night before Monday tryouts to tell me this. He comes into the house and says, all my friends are begging me to do this. What do you think I should do, Dad? I says, well, what do you think you should do? He says, well, I'm scared. No, that's not what I asked you. I said, what do you think you should do? And he says, well, I'm not sure. And I says, well, let me give you a couple of options here. Number one, you could not try out and not make the team. Or number two, you could try out and maybe have a slim chance of making this team. And they did go to state this year. Now, what's fascinating about it is he really kind of contemplated it for another 24 hours, but then finally, on Sunday night, he comes into a family meeting and he says, I think I want to do it. I says, okay, great. I says, what do you need? He says, I guess I need all the equipment. So on Sunday night, my wife went out to the local hockey store, bought $500 worth of hockey equipment that we did not have. She bought it for him, guessed at his size. He goes to school on Monday morning, comes home from school, has an hour break before tryouts, and we are in the basement, me and my son, putting on hockey gear he's never put on in his entire life. I'm looking at his face, and I can see that he's terrified. He's absolutely terrified. He looks at me, and I go, how do you feel? He goes, I'm scared to death. And I grabbed him by the shoulder pads, and I said, good. Good. Now I want you to get out there, and I want you to skate with some swagger and pretend like you know what you're doing. Right? Because you're about to do something that no one else in your grade has ever tried. And every one of your friends are going to know it. And I'm so proud of you in this moment. You went out for the first tryout. They asked you to come back for the second tryout. You got cut after the second tryout. But it didn't matter to me. It was the best $500 I ever spent. It was the best moment of helping my son understand what it looks like to fight that impulse of apathy in our own life. And I got to tell you, gentlemen, if you learn how to do that very quickly here and very soon and do it often, God will show up in ways you have never seen. And he will start doing things with your life that you thought were unbelievable. Seriously, unbelievable. You know, I didn't know 5 years ago when I started this organization that I was going to speak to men across the world. But we had 2 million men visit our website last month. 2 million dudes that want to know more about Jesus Christ visited our website last month. I mean, that's not about me. That's what God can do with a single man who fights an apathetic impulse. And so here is my challenge for you walking out of this room today. Fight this one apathetic impulse. Fight the impulse to not mentor another man. Fight the impulse to not mentor another man. Gentlemen, Jesus Christ built this mission upon the fact that he mentored and discipled 12 dudes. That was it. It's crazy math if you think about it. But Jesus Christ, that's all he did. He did it for 22 months. It wasn't forever. It was 22 months, backward engineering, all you want. 22 months. He spent daily with these guys, poured into their life. And you are sitting in this room because of what Jesus did with those 12 men. Isn't that crazy? Jesus came fighting an apathetic impulse and showing us how to do it. And yeah, he did all kinds of crazy cool things that you could never do. But there's one thing he did do that he commands you to do, that he wants you to do, that is dependent on you to do for the future of the kingdom. And when we don't do it, we hold back men from being better. Men from being followers of Christ. Men just like me.
who may end up influencing the world for the kingdom. So I have a number of resources out here for you. I have a couple of books that I brought with me today that are super easy to use. I have made this commitment to make easy-to-use mentoring resources for guys like you. This one's called 20 Lessons That Build a Leader. It can be used in any business setting. It can be used in a one-on-one relationship with another guy. It actually can be used with your sons and even your daughters, or at home with your family. 20 real simple, short chapters, usually about 2 to 3 pages, no more, and a group of questions to ask that invite discussion. Basically, what I'm holding in my hand is what my grandfather did with me when he had conversations with me in that truck. Because, see, he didn't just teach me how to drive. There was a lot of times we were parked where he was talking with me about life, leadership, and what it means to be a man. And I would encourage you to do this today. Either you need to be mentored, and you need a resource and a tool to do it, or you're ready to mentor someone else. But let me encourage you to not do one thing as I close. And I say this to all kinds of men all over the U.S. Don't do this. Don't do nothing. Because if you do nothing, you're contributing to the greatest problem that we have in all time. Thank you, John. Appreciate being with you guys today.